It was the night of May 3rd, 2007, Praia da Luz, Algarve. A small resort, warm air, families on holiday. A 3-year-old named Madeleine McCann disappears from apartment 5A while her parents dine nearby. The window was open. The shutters were raised. Madeleine was gone.
It's one of those cases where the ordinary details, the package holiday, the early bedtime, the routine checks, make the disappearance feel all the more difficult to explain. There's no single uncontested crime scene, and that complicates everything.
Right. And that's what we'll try to do today. Calmly, carefully. I'm Elena Hart, and with me is Dr. Marcus Llewellyn. Marcus, welcome back to Still Unanswered.
Thanks, Elena. It's good to be here. This case has many layers: procedural, forensic, media, and I'll do my best to unpack what we can say with confidence from the record.
Before we get into the details, let's set the scene for listeners. Marcus, in simple terms, who were the McCanns, and why were they in Praia da Luz?
Kate and Jerry McCann were middle-class British professionals, Kate a GP from Liverpool and Jerry a cardiologist from Glasgow. They were on a 1-week family holiday with their 3 children, Madeleine, born May 12, 2003, and twins Sean and Amelie, then 2, at the Ocean Club complex, booked through a British operator called Mark Warner. The resort offered kids' clubs and an evening dining arrangement that many families used.
So a pretty normal family holiday for that era.
Exactly. The complex had self-catering apartments, pools, a tapas restaurant where the adults dined, and childcare options. Many parents at the time used the system of periodic checks rather than a continuous babysitter. It was seen as normal in that environment.
By the way, the group they were with is often mentioned, the so-called Tapas 7. Can you remind listeners who they were?
Yes. The Tapas 7 were friends vacationing together: David and Fiona Payne, Russell O'Brien and Jane Tanner, Matthew and Rachel Oldfield, and the McCanns themselves. There was also another family, the Carpenters, who were acquaintances at the resort. Their presence matters because many of the evening witness statements come from them.
Okay, let's walk through that evening, as best as we can from the statements. Give us the timeline, Marcus.
Broadly, around 5:30 p.m, the children had high tea at the restaurant, and the family returned to apartment 5A. Kate bathed the children, got them into pyjamas. Jerry played tennis and returned around 7 p.m. The 3 children were settled in the front bedroom, Madeleine in a single bed near the window, the twins in cots. The parents left about 8:30 p.m. to eat at the tapas restaurant, implementing a plan to check on the sleeping children roughly every 30 minutes.
And that checking routine is central to everything that follows.
It is. The adults took turns going back to their apartments to check. The specifics of those checks, who saw what, when, and how clearly, are the backbone of reconstructing the evening, and they're also where the accounts begin to diverge slightly under scrutiny.
So let's get into the checks. Who checked when and what did they see? Start with the early one, David Payne's visit, I think.
Right. Around 6:40 p.m, David Payne visited apartment 5A at Jerry's request and saw the children in white pyjamas. He reported them as calm and content. Later that evening, there were a series of checks. Jerry himself reportedly checked at about 9:05 p.m, entering via the patio door and saying he found the children apparently asleep. Jane Tanner later described seeing a man carrying a child across the road around 9:10, 9:15 p.m, and Matthew Oldfield did a check around 9:30 p.m, saying he listened at the bedroom door and heard nothing amiss.
Jane Tanner's sighting, it's been discussed so much. She said she saw a man carrying a child, right?
Yes. Tanner reported a man carrying a child of about 3 or 4 in light-coloured pyjamas, barefoot, with the child's head resting on his shoulder. The man wore light trousers and a dark top. Importantly, she was not immediately alarmed. The sighting only became critical once Madeleine's absence was discovered.
And that's the thing. Hindsight changes how people interpret what they saw. Marcus, was there any confirmation later about that sighting?
Over time, there were attempts to reconcile it. A man later came forward saying it might have been him carrying his own child from a creche, which complicated things. Neither Jerry nor Jeremy Wilkins, who was nearby when Tanner said she passed them, recall seeing her at that moment. It's an example of how eyewitness reports can be ambiguous and why corroboration is so important.
So the checks go on. Then around 10 p.m, Kate checks and finds Madeleine missing. Tell us what Kate described.
Around 10 p.m, Kate returned to apartment 5A. She says she entered via the unlocked patio door, found the bedroom door wider open than before, felt a draft, and noticed the bedroom window open and the external metal shutters raised, with curtains billowing. The twins were still asleep. Madeleine's bed was empty. She ran back toward the tapas restaurant, shouting that Madeleine had been taken.
It's a short sentence, but it contains so much. The billowing curtains, the open shutters. The scene is unanswerable in many ways.
Yes. Those visual cues, open window and shutters, became central to the debate about how an abductor could have entered or whether something else had occurred in that room. But they don't, on their own, provide conclusive proof of anything.
Right. Let's pause there. We've got a missing child, a widening search at the resort. How quickly did the police get involved? The record suggests some confusion.
The timelines vary in reports. Resort staff contacted the local police, the GNR, and 2 officers arrived from Lagos, about 5 miles away, sometime between roughly 10:10 and 11:10 p.m. The Policia Judiciaria, the criminal police, were involved later that night, and forensic teams arrived within hours. But there are inconsistent recollections. Kate remembered the PJ arriving later, while some PJ records suggest they were contacted more quickly. This is another place where stress and trauma can create discrepancies in accounts.
And one of the criticisms was about contaminating the scene, the apartment, in those first hours.
Exactly. Many people, friends, guests, staff, and initial police officers moved through apartment 5A before it was properly sealed. That movement and an uncoordinated search across the complex likely complicated any forensic leads. There was also a delay in giving Madeleine's description to border and marine police, which meant the early hours weren't used as effectively as they could have been to stop someone leaving the region.
So those first hours matter, the so-called golden hours, and many of them were, to use a blunt phrase, lost. Marcus, when forensic teams did work the site and later examined vehicles, what did they find?
Forensic teams conducted fingerprinting and DNA sampling across the apartment, tiles, walls, furniture, and behind the sofa. But heavy contamination made interpretation difficult. Importantly, no definitive forensic evidence was publicly produced that conclusively proved what happened. Cadaver and blood scent dogs later alerted to areas in the apartment and to a rental car trunk, but those alerts did not lead to conclusive DNA linking Madeleine to those spots.
This is a good time to underscore a difference. Dog alerts are investigative leads, not courtroom proof, right?
Correct. The dogs, an Eddie for cadaver scent and Keela for blood detection, were valuable search tools. They reportedly alerted in the living room area and in the trunk of a Renault Scenic rented by the McCanns weeks later. But those alerts need corroborating physical evidence. In this case, DNA results were mixed or inconclusive, so the alerts alone could not be used as definitive proof.
And those dog alerts were one reason Portuguese police later named Kate and Jerry as arguido, formal suspects.
They were among the factors cited by some investigators. In September 2007, the McCanns were made arguido, in part due to those investigative leads and interpretations of the scene. The case was shelved in July 2008, with arguido status lifted, the official reason being insufficient evidence to proceed. So legally, being a suspect didn't lead to charges.
Yeah, and then there's Gonzalo Amaral, the lead PJ investigator, who later published a book asserting the parents covered up a death in the apartment. That turned into years of legal battles.
Amaral's book amplified the accidental death then cover-up theory in the public sphere.
The McCanns sued him for defamation, and there were protracted legal fights across Portuguese courts. The book influenced public perception, but its claims were never proven in a criminal court.
So we've covered the immediate timeline, initial police response, forensic work, and one major internal controversy. Let's talk about the broader media effect. Marcus, how did media attention shape this case?
Almost immediately, the case became a global media phenomenon. Front-page coverage in Britain and worldwide, celebrity endorsements, and an extensive public campaign, FindMadeleine.com, reportedly had millions of visitors in days, kept the story in public view. That attention kept resources on the case, but also created a swirl of leaks, speculation, and false leads that complicated professional investigation.
And it became, for many, emblematic of how missing white girls get disproportionate media attention, the so-called missing white girl syndrome.
That critique arose because of the contrast with many other missing children cases that receive far less coverage. The intense focus did mobilize resources and public awareness, but it also skewed priorities, brought on hoaxes, and turned the case into a narrative battleground rather than a pure evidence exercise.
Let's take a breath. Marcus, listeners ask for fair treatment of theories, so let's lay them out neutrally. What are the main theories people still discuss, and where does the evidence support or undermine them?
We can summarize the major lines. 1. Abduction by an unknown intruder. 2. An accidental death in the apartment followed by a cover-up. 3. Involvement by a third party with local knowledge. And 4. The later German focus on Christian Bruckner. Each explains some facts, but none explain everything, and none have produced the kind of conclusive proof needed for charges or conviction.
Start with the stranger abduction theory.
The stranger abduction theory fits several elements. The apartment was on the ground floor. The patio door was reportedly left unlocked by the parents to make checks easier, and the resort layout allowed movement in and out. Tanner's sighting of a man carrying a child around 9:10, 9:15 p.m. is often cited in support. But the counterpoint is there's no confirmed forensic trace of a specific intruder in the apartment, and some sighting explanations remain ambiguous.
And the accidental death and cover-up theory.
This theory gained traction due to the cadaver and blood dog alerts in the apartment and car, and due to interpretive statements by some PJ members like Anaral. Yet the forensic record didn't produce DNA that would conclusively identify Madeleine in those locations. Also, the lack of a body, despite extensive searches and international attention, undermines the plausibility that two parents could successfully conceal such an event without producing more definitive traces.
Third party with local knowledge.
That's a category rather than a single suspect. A worker, opportunistic thief, or someone who knew the resort layout. There were reports of burglaries and suspicious men in the area, and early suspect Robert Murat was Argidos at one point, though later cleared. This fits the idea of someone exploiting opportunity, but again, no direct forensic or eyewitness evidence pins a named person to the crime.
And then the Bruckner hypothesis, which has dominated headlines in recent years.
Christian Bruckner is a German national, convicted of sexual offences, who lived intermittently in the Algarve. German prosecutors named him a formal suspect in June 2020, and later said they believed Madeleine was dead. He had a pattern of offending in the region, and phone records that placed him in the area at times. That led to joint searches in Portugal in 2020, 2023, and again in June 2025, including areas like Barragem do Arade and land near Atalaya. But despite extensive searches and scrutiny, prosecutors have so far not produced the conclusive evidence needed for charges specifically tying him to Madeleine's disappearance.
So even with a named suspect and large search operations, there's still no prosecutable case.
Correct. German prosecutors have spoken of a strong suspicion, but acknowledged evidence remains insufficient to prosecute.
Search operations in 2025 used drones and ground-penetrating radar over dozens of hectares, but public reports didn't indicate a breakthrough that changes the legal position.
Let me interrupt, cutting in there, Marcus, because listeners always want one thing. What's missing? What are the core unresolved questions?
No problem. The key unknowns are, did a crime occur inside apartment 5A, and if so, what exactly? How did Madeleine leave the apartment? Patio door, window and shutters, or did she wander? Who, if anyone, definitively witnessed an abduction, and where is Madeleine now? To date, there's no confirmed crime scene, no definitive witness, no body, and no suspect charged for this disappearance.
Those 4 questions, they're devastating in their simplicity. We still don't know.
Yes, and those uncertainties have been the engine of decades of investigation, public debate, books, documentaries, and legal fights.
You mentioned Operation Grange earlier. Can you say a bit about the UK's involvement and the scale of the long-running inquiry?
Operation Grange was launched by the Metropolitan Police in 2011 as a review and later an active investigation. By March 2024, it had cost roughly £13.2 million, with additional funding for subsequent years. It's unusual for the UK to sustain that level of resourcing for a single missing child case, reflecting both the case's public profile and the complexity of cross-border investigation.
And that raises another issue, cross-border policing. Portugal, the UK, Germany, different police cultures, different legal rules. How did that affect the investigation?
It complicated coordination. Each jurisdiction has its own protocols, evidentiary standards, and media relations. The Portuguese PJ led the initial criminal inquiry, the GNR handled first response, the UK conducted reviews and then Operation Grange, and German authorities pursued lines linked to Bruckner. Harmonizing evidence and investigative steps across borders is never easy, and that made the case harder to resolve.
Let's talk about the human side for a moment. Madeleine would be an adult now, 22 as of 2025, and 22 going into 2026. That fact often gets lost in sensational reporting. How do you approach that, Marcus?
It's crucial to remember the human endpoint. If she were alive, she would be someone with a life, friends, maybe a profession. The human reality is that a missing child case is not only a legal puzzle, but a moral obligation to keep searching responsibly, to respect trauma, and to avoid turning the family into a perpetual public spectacle. That's why evidence-based approaches matter so much.
Yeah, and the McCanns continue to release statements every year. They say they will keep searching, insisting there's always the possibility of a different outcome.
They have maintained that position publicly, and from an investigative perspective, that statement, until there is proof otherwise we will keep searching, is consistent with families who hold out for answers. It's also why large-scale funding and occasional new searches continue to occur.
There's no shortage of fringe theories online, trafficking networks, conspiracies, but the source material is clear that there's no credible official evidence backing those elaborate conspiracies, right?
Right. Fringe theories often fill gaps with imaginative explanations, but official investigations, Portuguese, British, and German, have not produced evidence to support complex conspiracies like elite cover-ups or international trafficking networks specifically linked to Madeleine's disappearance. Those narratives persist in part because humans dislike uncertainty and will invent patterns.
Okay, listeners will want to know, what did the cadaver dogs actually alert to, and why wasn't that definitive? You explained a bit earlier, but let's be precise.
The cadaver dog alerted in the living room area, particularly near a sofa against a wall adjacent to the bedroom. The blood detection dog alerted to some spots near that sofa as well. Similar alerts were reported in the trunk area of a Renault Scenic rented by the McCanns about 3 weeks later. But lab work on DNA was inconclusive. Samples were often mixed, contaminated, or insufficient to produce a definitive match to Madeleine. Dogs are excellent screening tools, but without corroborating lab evidence, their alerts can't substitute for direct physical proof.
Shorter question now, Marcus. Were there signs of forced entry?
Public reporting notes no clear signs of forced entry, such as broken glass or tool marks that a consensus agrees on. PJ officers expressed scepticism that shutters could have been opened from outside without noise or damage, which is part of the debate about how entry occurred.
Let's talk about timeline inconsistencies, because they've been used to attack the parents' credibility in the public sphere. How do you think memory and trauma factor into those inconsistencies?
Memory under stress is notoriously unreliable. People recall events in different sequences, estimated time shift under trauma, and later recollections can be influenced by media and discussions. So while inconsistencies fuel suspicion in public debate, from a scientific perspective, they are often expected in high-stress, chaotic circumstances.
And yet some media coverage moved from sympathy to suspicion. Newspapers printed accusations, and some later paid libel damages.
Yes, several British newspapers published insinuations and later faced legal consequences, printing apologies and paying damages. That underscores the risk of trial by media. Premature judgments can harm families and distort public understanding before evidence is tested.
Marcus, quick interjection. The police made searches years later, including in 2025. What did those recent searches focus on, and what was the public result?
The more recent searches, including the joint German-Portuguese operations in 2025, focused on areas linked to Christian Bruckner's movements, Barajen do Arade, and land near Atalaya, close to Praia da Luz. They used advanced techniques like drones and ground-penetrating radar and covered dozens of hectares. Publicly, those searches wrapped up without announcing a breakthrough. Prosecutors said suspicion remained, but evidence was still insufficient for prosecution.
So despite modern technology, no smoking gun emerged publicly. Marcus, some listeners will ask, is there a most likely scenario in your professional view?
As a criminologist, I prefer to say plausible scenarios exist, but likelihoods depend on evidence. A stranger abduction remains plausible given the resort context and ground floor apartment, and the Bruckner hypothesis is plausible given his offending profile and presence in the area, but plausible is not the same as proven. The accidental death hypothesis fits some investigative interpretations but lacks forensic confirmation. The honest answer is there isn't a single scenario that all the available evidence definitively supports.
That honesty is important. Let's talk about impact. Have practices changed for family holidays because of this case?
Yes, to some degree. There's been raised awareness about leaving children unattended, even briefly, in holiday complexes. Resorts have enhanced CCTV and security in many places, and parents have become more cautious about relying on periodic checks rather than a dedicated babysitter or childcare. The case contributed to that change in perception.
And media law, public debate about press responsibility and libel, that changed a bit too, right?
There were prominent legal cases and libel settlements that highlighted the dangers of speculative reporting. The McCann's legal actions helped push conversations about press regulation and the need for careful reporting and active investigations.
Marcus, on a more personal note, you worked with police forces. How do long, cold cases like this affect investigators over time?
They can be emotionally taxing. Investigators carry the weight of unresolved harm and public expectation. Over the years, new technicians, new methods, and new leads can give hope, but there's also fatigue. Good investigators try to remain methodical, avoid confirmation bias, and revisit old evidence when new techniques, like improved DNA analysis, offer fresh possibilities.
The sources we're using underline that the core mystery endures. Let's be clear with listeners. What does the public record say about Madeleine's status as of now?
Publicly, as of the most recent reporting, no definitive legal conclusion has been reached. German prosecutors have expressed the view they believe she is dead, and they have named a strong suspect in Bruckner, but they lack sufficient evidence to charge. No body or conclusive forensic trace has been found, and no one has been successfully prosecuted for her disappearance.
And that brings us back, painfully, to the 4 basic unanswered questions you mentioned earlier.
Yes, what happened in apartment 5A, how she left the apartment, who witnessed the abduction if it was one, and where she is now. Those remain unanswered.
Before we wrap up, Marcus, what should listeners take away from this case, beyond the headlines and the theories?
Take away this. The absence of certainty doesn't mean investigators weren't competent, nor does it mean the truth is simple. The case shows how vital early scene control is, how evidence can be degraded by well-intentioned actions, and how media pressure can both help and hinder. Above all, it's a reminder that unresolved cases demand patient, evidence-based work and humility when the evidence is ambiguous.
That humility is rare in big headlines. For people who want to learn more, our episode notes link to the main sources, timelines from Wikipedia, The Guardian, Reuters' coverage of the 2025 searches, and other contemporaneous reporting. We've stuck closely to those public records today.
And one practical note, when you read about cadaver dog alerts or lab results, look for corroboration, whether DNA was conclusive, whether the lab could isolate a profile. That helps separate investigative leads from proof.
Marcus, quick question more for listeners. If new evidence emerges, what kind of evidence would change this case legally?
Conclusive DNA evidence linking a suspect to Madeleine or to her presence at a particular location would be transformative. A body with identifiable remains linked to a perpetrator, or undisputed corroborating eyewitness testimony placing a suspect with the child at a specific time, could also change the legal status. In short, evidence that moves from plausible to provable.
We'll close with a fact that often strikes me. Madeleine would be 22 now. The simplest arithmetic makes it so stark.
Yes. It's a reminder of the human stakes behind the headlines. Cases like this are not just puzzles. They are about a missing person who, if alive, has a life that should be found.
Thank you, Marcus. Listeners, if you value evidence-based, careful coverage of unresolved cases, please subscribe to Still Unanswered. We try to do the hard work of separating what's known from what's rumoured.
Thank you, Elena. And to anyone listening, if you have information that you believe is relevant to this case, the proper route is to contact the authorities. Portuguese PJ, the Metropolitan Police's Operation Grange links, or the German authorities who have led recent lines of inquiry.
Madeleine McCann would be a young adult now. The public record tells us a lot about how investigations were handled, how media shape the narrative, and how people have tried to answer impossible questions. But after all these years, the most basic questions remain unanswered.
And that lack of resolution is the very reason professionals and families alike keep searching, because truth still matters, even when it is slow to appear.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I'm Elena Hart. We'll be back with another Still Unanswered episode soon. Until then, stay curious and be critical.
Goodbye, everyone.
Wow.
Interesting.
Uh-huh.
Right.
So, Marcus, one last tiny point. The public sometimes wonders about the rental car and why it was examined. A short answer?
Because the cadaver and blood dogs alerted to the trunk area of the Renault Scenic rented by the McCanns weeks after the disappearance, investigators followed that lead. Lab tests on samples were mixed and inconclusive, which is why it didn't produce a prosecutable result.
I see. And people often conflate dog alerts with DNA matches, which they are not.
Exactly. Dogs give avenues to test later with lab work, but they don't replace it.
Okay, we'll leave that there. Marcus, thank you again.
Thanks, Elena. Take care.
Good night.